Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. If you regularly check out the podcast, you know that I am an extremely high-performing self-righteous lib. I've won several trophies at self-righteous lib competitions, and once was called one of the most impressive self-righteous libs under the age of 40. The awards and accolades go on and on, attesting to my intense and powerful libness. And you know, professors in the humanities and social sciences, well, let's face it, most of us are a bunch of libs. And one thing about libs is that, by definition, we believe in the potentials of government to solve various problems. I mean, that's definitely true of me. My first book, Moving Violations, was, among other things, a defense of regulation is not impeding innovation, but often contributing to and even driving it. When we lib professors teach the history of technology, or U.S. history more generally, there's this story we like to tell about how government can improve technological outcomes. And it goes like this. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, electrical utilities were quickly building out their systems and electrifying all kinds of aspects of American society, but they were neglecting rural places because they were not seen as profitable. And it was only when Franklin Roosevelt created the Rural Electrification Administration in the New Deal that electricity finally came to rural America. It was only through the power of the state that that happened. But there's a problem. It appears this story has been a kind of morality tale, not so rooted in historical fact. At the very least, the story is far more complicated than the standard narrative that libs like me so adore. It looks like, if we're going to be truthful, we're going to have to update our lectures. Daggone it. I hate that. This is what we learn in Powering American Farms, The Overlooked Origins of Rural Electrification by Richard Hirsh, a professor of history here at Virginia Tech. Hirsh uses extensive archival sources to show that there was a wide variety of activities around electrification in rural places well before federal involvement, including work by farmers, university researchers, and, even electrical utilities. This revisionist history offers many fascinating stories and interesting twists that upend much of what's been said about rural electrification. This episode is also the second of what will eventually be many interviews featuring folks here at Virginia Tech, and for that reason, we were able to record this interview in person. So you can head over to our YouTube channel at, one word, People's Things, no and or ampersand, and see Richard and me chatting. I also believe it's true that Richard's earlier two books on the history of electricity were the first things that my doctoral advisor, David Hounshell, had me read when I got to grad school. They left a big impression on me, and since then, I've taught them to many others. It's an honor to have Richard as a mentor, colleague, friend, and now Peoples and Things guest. I had a lot of fun talking to him. You'll see. Hey, get excited! Professor Hirsh, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Always a pleasure, Lee.
We really should be doing this from a hot tub, though I think soaking with Lee would be a different kind of show, I think.
It could have wide appeal, though.
It could. So Powering American Farms is a neat book. When you explain it to strangers, what do you say it's about, and what were you trying to do with it?
Powering American Farms is a revisionist history of rural electrification in the United States. It does not tell the standard story of rural electrification. That standard story is that during the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt set up the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, in 1935. And because of the activities of that organization, farmers who had been previously neglected by private electric utility companies finally got a chance to get wired up.
Mm-hmm.
And as it turns out, when I did research about that topic, I found that no, there was quite a bit of utility company work being done on rural electrification in the 1920s and into the 1930s. And it was quite substantial, and it contradicted the standard history of rural electrification. And that's basically what I was writing about. Again, the standard history is very well known. There are famous historians who have written about the New Deal and have written wonderful things about how FDR brought electricity to these beleaguered and forgotten farmers. And it turns out that's not the complete story. There's a lot of nuance involved there.
Right on. And we will look into all kinds of elements of that. It's a very pretty book. So it's got this neat image on the front with this red Wing Blackbird. Where'd this come from?
That cover is certainly not original. That cover comes from that's actually the cover of a utility-related report written in 1924 by a group of agricultural engineers and utility people in Minnesota. And they put together one of the first experiments on rural electrification to see what farmers would use electricity for, how much electricity they would use, whether electricity service to farmers could be profitable to both farmers and to utility companies. And this report from this group in 1924 had that beautiful cover on it. That's a red Wing Blackbird.
Yeah.
And the report was done about people who used electricity on farms in Red Wing, Minnesota.
Oh, I see. So there's a little play there.
I think there is. I can't, that's my take of it.
Yeah. And then you have a section in the center with these wonderful colored plates.
Yes.
You have a real eye. I didn't know this about you as a historian. So all of the images you pulled out are really nice. So
it is an image-rich story. Yeah. It really is. And there were some great photographs there. For people who are writing books, you have to be aware, though, that publishers don't like to publish
they don't like to do this
color
anymore.
Pictures because they're expensive.
Yeah.
I ended up having to put some money into the production of the book.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah, they're fun pictures. They're very nice images.
So this is not the first book you've written about electricity. You wrote
Correct.
2 other books on electricity.
2 other books and one very related book, my first one dealing with high-energy astrophysics done from outer space, which has nothing to do with electricity.
Oh yeah, then you became a historian of electricity.
I did, yes.
And what were the other 2 books about? And just to give listeners a general sense of your career.
So the first electricity book was called Technology and Transformation in the American Electric Utility Industry. It is a book about the changes in technology and management of the technology in the utility industry from around, the beginning of the industry until the 1970s or so. And it was, the industry did amazingly good work in terms of incrementally improving technologies that enabled companies to make electricity in larger quantities and at lower cost. And you see from the beginning of the 20th century to about 1970 that the cost and price of electricity dropped by like 98%.
Yeah.
Okay, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And America became a country dependent on electricity and lots of it. But starting in the 1970s, there were a whole bunch of problems that the industry did not manage terribly well at first. You had the oil embargo and energy prices going up. But worse than that, and what most people who looked at this era didn't realize, was that the improvement in the technology did not continue to occur. So I wrote about the management culture and some of the management problems there. So it's not just a hardware story, it's more of an STS-ish historical story looking at people's attitudes, their cultures, the way they learn things, and so on. The second electricity book is called Power Loss. And if I remember the subtitle right, it was, what was it? It was Power Loss, the restructuring and, deregulation and restructuring of the American utility system. It sort of picks up the story in the 1970s and deals with how the utility industry dealt with many of these problems, in particular how it started moving toward energy efficiency and conservation measures, which are very different, how regulation did not seem to be able to help the industry overcome many of the problems of the 70s, and how the deregulation movement took hold in the 1990s, resulting in the state of California, for example, being the first one to largely deregulate elements of its utility system, but not very successfully. So that there were lots of problems in the early 2000s with deregulation, and many states that had started experiments with deregulation gave up on those experiments and went back to more traditional regulation. So those are the two electricity books. This book, Powering American Farms, is one that I had no intention of ever writing. And it was something that just came about as an accident. And
well, go on. I mean, that was actually what I was going to ask you next, is kind of like how you got onto this. So.
In about 2011 or so, I was asked by Alan Marcus, who is a historian of technology, to write a chapter on electrical engineering at land-grant colleges in anticipation of the 2012 150th anniversary of the Land-Grant Act. 1862 was the act, created universities like Virginia Tech and
so many others.
So many others. Okay. So he asked me, because he knew I did work on history of electricity, that I might want to write a chapter in this book that he was putting together in a conference. So I started doing research on that, thinking, I'll just document what happened at Virginia Tech in the 1880s and 90s, how electrical engineering got going at this land-grant college, and then expand from there. And I did that, but in the process of spending time in the archives here in this Newman Library, and few hundred feet from where we are now, I discovered all these documents from people who were not electrical engineers, but who were agricultural engineers, and who were doing work on electrification and rural electrification, starting in the 1920s or so. And one of the big names was Charles Seitz. We have a Seitz Hall on campus. And it was just amazing. Why are these guys doing rural electrification work 10, 15 years before the Rural Electrification Administration existed? It just didn't fit into my understanding of the history of rural electrification, which I had actually been interested in from my readings in college about how wonderful the REA was. And I read the standard histories and all that stuff. Anyway, so I started pursuing that work and discovered that agricultural engineers at about half of the state's land-grant colleges were doing work on rural electrification sponsored by the Utility Industries Trade Organization, the National Electric Lighting Association, Light Association. And they were funding these ag engineers in coordination with the US Department of Agriculture, the American Farm Bureau Federation, a bunch of agricultural organizations that were also providing support, and individual utilities in these states. So Seitz, for example, was doing work in the state trying to figure out how electricity could be beneficial to farmers and how utility companies might be interested in serving more farmers. The big problem, the fundamental problem here, was that to string lines to farmers who lived in sparsely settled communities was very expensive.
Yeah.
A distribution line at the time would cost maybe $1,500 or $2,000 per mile, which was significant back then. And there'd be 1 or 2 customers or 3 customers.
Yeah.
Versus that same line in a city that could serve 500 to 1,000 customers.
Mm-hmm.
So there were much greater economies and much greater potential for making profits to companies that served city residents, urban residents, rather than rural residents.
Mm-hmm.
But if farmers could be shown to be profitable customers, then by all means, companies would be interested
Mm-hmm.
in them, perhaps. So there were these experiments going on all around the country dealing with how farmers could use electricity. And while today we think it's obvious, right? Everyone wants electricity.
Yeah, no.
Of course, it's kind of obvious. It wasn't so obvious
Yeah.
back then. Everyone wanted electric lights. That was clear. But to have a few electric lights in a house would not produce enough or not demand enough electricity for power companies to make money.
Yeah.
So if the power companies could help farmers come up with new ways to use electricity, then serving them would be profitable. So there were all these experiments being done. Charles Seitz ran one of the experiments dealing with an experiment that electrified and illuminated hen houses. Okay, so there'd be a hen house that would be split into a hen house is a house that houses hens. An amazing, it's a technical term, Lee. I hope you understood that. You got that?
Really helped.
Okay.
That really helped.
So he split the hen house in 2. It was normally illuminated by sunlight, and that's it, right?
Uh-huh.
So at the end of the day, no sunlight. The chickens would just be in darkness. Okay. He found that if you illuminate the hen houses with electric lights, the chickens will produce a lot more eggs. And in just one season, you could produce enough eggs to make enough money to pay for wiring the farm.
Wow.
Wiring the barn,
Yeah.
rather, the hen house itself.
Huh.
Okay? So, this is something that wasn't obvious, but here he did this experiment and used, he had graduate students who were doing all their economic analyses and all, and demonstrated, this was pretty cool. You could do that. And then there were other things you could use electricity for, different types of motors, and a whole bunch of different processes on a farm that previously perhaps used steam engines or human power. Shelling of peas, for example, turned out to be really a good thing for using electric motors.
And there was also like wild experiments, things we would not think of today that you found, like putting electricity into the ground to help plants grow. And...
That's right. It seems like electricity would be naturally desired by farmers, it was obvious. But there were people who were also saying, well, we can stimulate plant growth by sticking electrodes in the ground.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that wasn't the case as much as people had hoped. There were people who were saying, there were advocates of using overhead lines to then bring electricity to electric plows, for example. In principle, that makes a lot of sense. Electric motors are very simple motors, very rugged. But it turns out that when people did experiments with, there was competition coming in the 19-teens and 20s, namely gasoline-powered tractors, which turned out to be much cheaper and much more versatile. And of course, not everyone has electric lines going over their farms. Okay, so that didn't turn out to be something that worked out as people may have expected. Electric refrigeration. Everyone wants electric refrigeration. But in the 1920s, electric refrigerators were extremely expensive and really dangerous. They used refrigerants like ammonia And if the ammonia leaked from one of the pipes in the refrigerators, people literally died. Okay, so things that today we think are just obvious were not so obvious back then. It wasn't until the 1930s when General Motors came out with Freon that that refrigerators started to catch on for domestic use. And that gets into the REA period, to be sure. And that was a great builder of load. But it wasn't 100% obvious that farmers would use a lot of electricity, where they would use it for anything beyond electric lights. And therefore, these experiments being done by the land-grant agricultural engineers helped demonstrate that, yes, there were a whole bunch of uses that made sense to the farmers and to the utility companies. Farmers used to complain. There are stories of farmers who complained about paying $5 a month for electricity for the few lights they had in the house. But they didn't mind paying $15 a month when they had all this productivity enhancing equipment that yielded much more than the difference in price, than the extra amount of money they had to pay for the electricity. But again, it wasn't totally obvious. And this is one of the things I try to emphasize in the book, is that from today's perspective, we think that people in the past wanted electricity. It was obvious they wanted electricity. But that's doing history from the present to the past, not from the past to the present. In the 1920s, yes, electricity was one of the modern marvels that people wanted, to be sure, but there were lots of other things going on too. Farmers in the 20s wanted good roads to get their goods to market. They wanted telephones, automobiles, tractors. All these things were coming in pretty much at the same time. And electricity actually was not at the top of the list. Even though today we think, well, you know, the National Academy of Engineers in 2000 noted that electricity was the top new technology of the 20th century. Okay? Yeah, we know that now, right? But back then, especially among farmers, it was not yet obvious. So,
what kind of research did you do for this book?
Yeah, it was research that I didn't have to do with my previous books. So my other books on electricity, and even my book on X-ray astronomy, I interviewed lots and lots of people. It's hard to interview people from more than 100 years ago, obviously. So I did a lot of archival research at land-grant universities around the country, obviously Virginia Tech, but also Auburn University, University of North Carolina, University of Vermont, a couple of universities in California, Idaho, Washington, few others I missed, but lots of archival research where I found some delightful documents, often handwritten documents from the ag engineers, but also because at land-grant universities you have the extension services of the state. You had, I found these wonderful letters.
Tell people what extension is, just so in case they don't know.
Okay, so first of all, land-grant schools were created using funds from the sale of federal lands out west largely. And that money went to the states, and the states created these universities or colleges that were focused on agricultural pursuits. And have universities like Texas A&M, agriculture and mechanical. Virginia Tech used to be called Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College, VAMC. Okay, so great. So you have these schools that were devoted to work and teaching middle class and lower class people, largely non-elite students, teaching them about agriculture, modern agriculture and engineering. At these colleges, the states also created or integrated these extension services. So the extension service takes the knowledge that is produced at universities and brings it to individual farmers. So there are extension agents in every county of every state, and the agent's jobs, the agent's job rather, is to bring the new knowledge to the farmers, technically.
Yeah.
So you had all these extension agents who would then be bringing information to farmers. And in the 1920s, you had, again, these land-grant colleges and the ag engineers developing this new knowledge. They also would disseminate the knowledge with the extension agents by having conferences on campus to teach about rural electrification, to teach about new uses for electricity, to teach women how to use electric ovens and electric stoves, to teach people how to even use just electric lights and how to wire one's house efficiently and at a, without spending a huge amount of money. So you have this other institution related to the land-grant colleges that helped spread rural electrification. And of course, the land-grant colleges were teaching students ag engineering and teaching new methods and new techniques in rural electrification technologies. Many of the students from here, for example, went to work for utility companies and then worked in what became these rural, these farm divisions of electric utility companies. And the fact that so many of these companies created these rural divisions with trained rural electrification agents suggests that no, the utility companies did not necessarily totally ignore the farmers.
I was going to ask you how much the utility companies paid you to, write this hymn to their beneficence.
You're right. Okay. And you can tell by the way I'm dressed, for example, that they paid me a huge amount of money to dispel the traditional propaganda. Actually, in the book, I make a point of saying, I'm not a shill for the utility industry.
Yes, I saw that.
Because it could be viewed as that. However, I should also point out that in the book, I do note that many of the motives of the utility companies were not necessarily pure, right? They were trying to dispel some very bad propaganda, very bad public relations that were going on that occurred in the 1920s as well. And especially after 1928, before the stock market crash and the Great Depression really started, the utility industry was suffering some bad press because the Federal Trade Commission started an investigation of the utility industry and found that the industry had been spending millions university professors to say nice things about the utility industry, to pay off regulators, to pay off regulators and others who were making the utility industry perhaps look better than it should have. So the industry was, some industry leaders were looking at rural electrification efforts as a way to try to counter some of the bad press that the industry was getting.
Why do you think that message worked? Or, why would they think that message would work? Are they bringing modernity to these people, or what is it?
Well, that's, of city folk were exposed to electricity first. And indeed, electricity did bring many of the elements of modernity, right? You have electric lights, you have electric entertainment, electric cooking, electric heating, electric cooling in big spaces. Indeed, electricity was a modern marvel. And city folk in particular thought that the farmers were, backwards. They were hayseeds and all. So to be sure, one element of this was to, one element I would imagine that utility managers thought of was, oh, look, we're helping the farmers. We're bringing modernity to the farm. And you can read nice stories about how in farm magazines, for example, and even utility magazines, about how the farm was becoming modern with electric lights and electricity, and that the smartest people who grew up on farms would go to a land-grant college, get a degree, and then never come back to the farm.
Yeah.
Because they had seen the big city, they had gotten educated, they wouldn't want to come back to the farm. But with electricity on the farm, people would be willing to stay there. And there was this great movie made by this Minnesota group that did rural electrification experiments, a movie which you can actually find online now. Can you get it online? I have a digital version of it that came from the University of Minnesota, and it shows, among other things, a scene in which this this farmer male brings home to the farm his new city bride. She lived in the city. He brings her back to the farm. He shows her all the modern conveniences in his electrified house and the electrified barn, and she's just thrilled. And there's a pretty risque scene in there in which she's sitting on his lap and gives him a little kiss, and then it becomes a more serious kiss, and it sort of fades out there. Thankfully.
So it's the opposite of Green Acres, then, is what you're saying. She's happy on the farm.
She is very happy on the farm, yes. And Green Acres is another, to be sure, another historical documentary, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
That deals with life on the farm from a different perspective. Yes.
So we talked. I just want to go back to one thing really quick and make sure we hit this. The standard narrative that you're revising through your account, which is that the utilities neglected farms until the New Deal, basically, right? And government sweeps in and benefits these folks. Where does that story come from?
Yeah, okay, here's another case in which, if you look from the present to the past, it seems like that story makes a lot of sense. In 1923, there were like 177,000 farms that had electricity. That's about 2.5% of the 6 million farms. So, yeah, not many farms. Throughout the 1920s, with all this work being done by utility people, agricultural engineers and others, that number went up to about 8 or 9%, 10% by around 1929. And in fact, if you look at the growth rate, it's something like 21% per year on average, which is a pretty good
high growth rate.
That is a high growth rate. To be sure, it starts from a low level.
Right.
But if you continued like that during the Roaring '20s, then you would have gotten every farm electrified by the 1940s without government help. Okay? Of course, you had the Depression intervene and lots of other problems, obviously. Okay, so you go from 2.3% to about 9%. You're quadrupling the numbers of farmers in this period. And from the 1923 perspective, quadrupling by 1933 is pretty good, but you're still only at about 10 or 11%. Okay, so so again, it doesn't look great from the present because you also know that from 1935 to 1950 you go from 11-12% to 85%.
Right.
Okay, so that's a huge increase. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So where did this story come from and why was it so appealing? You had people within the REA, to be sure, who were pushing this.
This is the Rural Electrification Administration.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you had the first administrator, Morris Cook, who kept pushing this notion that the farmers had been neglected by the utility companies. And it made a lot of sense to do that because Cook and the REA was trying to get resources from Congress to lend money to farmers groups that would then wire up communities and bring electricity to them from the central power stations and from other sources. And all that was very nice. It was also a very appealing story in part because starting in 1928, the electric utility industry was getting such a bad rap. I already mentioned the Federal Trade Commission hearings, but beyond that, when the stock market crashed in 1929 and utility holding company organizations, and while there were holding companies used in several other industries, in the utility industry, it was used to leverage profits for people who owned stock in the holding companies. The holding companies owned stock of operating companies, and there were ways at the time when you could leverage profit. So when the individual utility company made money, well, the higher up, the pyramided holding companies could make even more money. The problem was when they stopped making that money, when the Depression hit, when industrial activity declined and sales of electricity dropped, the utility companies lost money, but the holding companies that were leveraging the assets then ended up losing huge amounts of money. And in fact, many of these holding companies went bankrupt, including some companies run by Samuel Insull, who was the head of a few of these holding companies and who had done amazing things to build up the utility industry to what it was. But the stock market crash then accelerated the problems with utility companies and holding companies, and people who had invested, including widows and orphans, a term that was used even back then, people who had bought stock in these utility companies and holding companies thinking they were safe and solid investments that were protected by regulation, state regulation. When these companies collapsed and people lost everything, they started blaming the utility industry. So the utility industry had another dose of really bad news, to be sure. And President Roosevelt took aim at the utility industry, such that during the New Deal, there were a bunch of new laws passed to restructure the utility industry to prevent the types of abuses that occurred in the 1920s leading up to the Depression. So the utility industry was already in the doghouse. And then then Morris Cook and supporters of the REA would say, look, not only did they bankrupt so many American investors, the utility industry also has been neglecting a part of society that we depend on, the farmers.
Right.
So it was really a very clever way to enhance the image of the REA. And lots of other people picked up on this. And
you think
indeed,
historians just kind of internalized this narrative?
Well, first of all, there weren't a lot of historians who wrote about the REA. But those who did picked up on this traditional narrative. So you had people like Arthur Schlesinger and William Leuchtenberg, who wrote these volumes about the New Deal in the 1950s and 60s. And they didn't write a lot about the REA, but they picked up on that narrative. Because it's a great narrative in which it's a great narrative that shows the importance of the federal government during an amazingly difficult time. In a narrative I still accept, that the federal government probably saved capitalism in America. And the New Deal did some amazing things. And I don't disparage what the REA did. But when people write about and talk about how, in 1950, 86% of farms had electricity, and that's because of the REA. What they don't point out is that half of the farms that had electricity, half of those 86% of those farms are actually served by utility companies, not by the REA. And it was only in 1950 or so that the REA had wired up more farms than the utility industry. And when the rural electrification rate hit like 98% at the end of the 1950s, 1960 or so, electric utility companies had still wired up 45, 46% of those farms.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I explain in the book why the utility industry accelerated its work in the 1930s.
You make an argument in those later chapters that it's in part like a response to the government action, right?
Oh, yes. Oh, definitely. The utility industry responded to this massive effort that the REA was picking up on.
Mm-hmm.
In part, so one way to look at that is that by the 1930s, the utility industry and its partners at land-grant colleges and elsewhere had done good work and had demonstrated to farmers that electricity could really prove profitable to them and to utility companies themselves as well. And out in California, just as an aside, the Californians were way ahead of everyone in California, Washington State, Idaho, Utah, states that depended on irrigation for farming.
Yeah.
And starting in the early 20th century, 1900s, 1900s, farmers in those states found that electrically operated irrigation pumps were so much better than other types of ways to pump water into irrigation canals.
Yeah.
And they started using electricity galore, such that by 1930, 60% about farmers in California had electricity.
Wow.
Okay. So this is before the REA. In Utah, 50-some%. People were using electricity and in such large quantities that the electric companies were thrilled to send wires to these farms. And then, of course, people used the electricity not just for irrigation pumps, but for lighting and motors.
The home's an afterthought after that, though.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Irrigation was the driving force. Yeah. Okay. So, so it was clear by the 1930s, because of work done in California, out west, I should say, and because of this work done in the 1920s or so, that utility officials were becoming more confident that farmers could use electricity in sufficient quantities that they would be able to make money from them. Should also point out that the other markets for electricity were getting somewhat saturated. So by the 1920s, industry was utility companies had gotten much of the industrial customers out there. And then in the 1920s into the 30s, they were getting most of the city residential customers. In 1920, something like 40% of people in cities had electricity. So, and they were going to be more profitable than the farmers. So work on the city folk first. Okay, by the end of the 20s, a good majority of the city residents had been wired up. Okay, so the next step is perhaps going to the farm market, which was looking like it was going to be better. And the utility officials likely saw that if they did not jump in and go for the farm market in the 30s, the REA would come and take them all. So it was, according to some accounts that I read, a concerted effort to go in now or never go in. Previously, the utility officials could say, well, we can wait for the farm market to develop, but not with the REA serving as competition there. So they jumped in and grabbed, by 1950, about half the farm market, and then the REA picked up more afterwards.
It sounds like a kind of a classic technology adoption story where you have there's these charts, you have these slow adoption curves, and then you'll have this period of rapid adoption. And part of that story, if you look at classic Rogers' Diffusion of Innovations book and stuff like that, is that early on people aren't very sure if this thing's going to work out. There's a lot of bugs. Do I really need this thing? Then knowledge spreads of actually it's helpful. There's all these uses. And it really sounds like things were kind of primed for a takeoff by this point.
By the 1930s, I think you're right.
Yeah.
And even private utilities discovered that once customers got electricity, even just for a few appliances, they then started growing or increasing their consumption of electricity.
Yeah.
Okay, we have lights and we have irrigation. Oh, that toaster is pretty neat.
Yeah.
That radio is pretty neat. A vacuum cleaner. Gee, that's pretty neat. So people, once they got electricity, started using more of it. Now, certainly the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Rural Electrification Administration had demonstrated similar things in the 1930s, and much more dramatically, perhaps.
Yeah.
But the utility people were realizing that, once people got electricity, they started using it more.
Yeah. You have this chapter titled Momentum in the Rural Electrification Subsystem.
Yes.
And so you're drawing on Thomas Hughes' concept of momentum here.
Yeah, how about that?
And so I was hoping you'd explain that. And is it connected to what we're talking to right now? Is that what you're seeing there?
Yeah, of course. So Thomas Hughes wrote this wonderful book in 1982, Networks of Power, in which he described the systems approach in history of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And he pointed out that systems of technologies develop not just because of great engineering and technology, but because of the support from lots of different players.
Mm-hmm.
So you have companies, you have educational institutions, you have financial institutions. It's a socio-technical system, not just a technical system like one would learn about in an engineering course,
Mm-hmm.
engineering systems. Okay, so in rural electrification, you had a subsystem, I argue. It was sort of like the overall utility system, which was by the 1920s fairly well developed. You had the standard technologies, the steam turbines, the generators. These technologies were developed early in the 20th century. And you had the financial institutions that were feeding money into this capital-intensive utility industry. You had universities that were producing these electrical engineers for the utility system. And I like the systems approach. It's a very flexible approach, and it helps one understand, I think, pretty explicitly that technical systems are not just technical, they're social as well. Great. But when I look at rural electrification, I saw, when I looked at it, I saw, well, this is sort of a subsystem.
Mm-hmm.
You have many of the same people involved in this utility system, in the subsystem of rural electrification, but they're a little different. So instead of having the electrical engineers in the rural electrification subsystem playing big roles, instead you have the agricultural engineers. Okay, and with the development of the REA, Rural Electrification Administration, in the 1930s, you have an organization that is providing financial support for rural electrification in a way that the utility system had not had financial support previously. So the REA jumps in and actually modifies this subsystem, which, just like the large bulk of electricity is in this country back then and even today is produced by private electric companies. Those same companies thought eventually, they'll wire up all the farms, it'll be theirs, nothing to worry about. But it turned out that these new players, the Rural Electrification Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Electric Home and Farm Administration, these new players intervened in a way that enabled these outsiders to have more control over the rural electrification subsystem than did the traditional electric utility managers. So there's a nice play there, I thought. A way to use that systems approach to help understand more about the rural electrification system or subsystem, and why why the utility managers lost control
Mm-hmm.
over that system, the subsystem they thought.
No, I had the momentum piece to that.
The momentum piece. Thank you very much for bringing me back. You're a good interviewer. You know how to bring people back to the topic. Well, in the 1920s, I argue the momentum increased because you had a bunch of these different players, different actors getting into the show. So you had the
Hughes. What is momentum in Hughes' picture? Like, what is happening in the system at that point?
Well, in physics, momentum is mass times velocity, and it's a vector quantity, so going in a certain direction.
Okay.
So you have a lot of capital, a lot of people who are educated to work within an existing technical system.
Mm-hmm.
So the utility system that Hughes writes about includes these electrical engineers who are making incremental improvements in steam turbines, in generators, in transmission technologies. And you have the financial institutions pouring in millions of dollars to support all this. You have financial institutions, educational institutions. You have a culture developing as well of people who want electricity and who like the system that exists. You have regulators that are regulatory institutions in almost every state that is enabling the utility companies to act as regional monopolies and assuring that they earn enough money to pay off their investors and to build and upgrade equipment in their system. So I have all these different. I didn't really talk about the politicians who are supporting the utility industry as well, the regulators. You have all these different elements that are supporting the utility system and the way it looked like it was going, in which everyone in the country would ultimately have wires stringing from power plants, coal-burning power plants or hydroelectric power plants, with wires going everywhere, crisscrossing the landscape, going into every home and farm in the country. And that was you had all these elements that were building momentum to yield this positive result of electrification for everyone at lower and lower cost. So the momentum in the rural electrification subsystem consisted of more than just these agricultural engineers who were doing this research. You had at utility companies these rural electrification agents that were being hired in larger and larger numbers. You had regulators who were simplifying the way that farmers could get electricity. Before the mid-1920s, if a farmer wanted electricity, the farmer would go to the utility company and say, I want electricity. And there would be sort of a one-on-one ad hoc basis for the utility to serve the farmer. And it often was very expensive, and very often the utility companies required the farmers to put up the money upfront to pay for the distribution line to their farms, which was very expensive. Regulators that were responding to other pressures and saying, this type of approach will stymie rural electrification. Why not do some experiments? And in several states, farmers would put up a portion of the money every year over a 10-year period to pay back the utility company. And if the utility company actually made more money than it needed, it would refund some of the money. So in various states, you had regulatory reforms going on that made it easier for farmers to get electricity. You also had in many states and many utility company areas, utilities would have these demonstrations, these fairs at agricultural fairs. They would demonstrate electrical equipment and try and get farmers interested in electricity. At universities like Virginia Tech, there were these agricultural engineering
short courses.
Short courses, thank you, Lee. Short courses to teach utility people and to teach farmers and anyone interested
totally
how to expand the use of electricity. So when I talk about momentum, I'm talking about how you have a bunch of different elements all moving in the same direction to spur rural electrification. The ag engineers, the companies with their rural farm division representatives, the demonstrations, the short courses, and all these students who are being produced at universities to do work in rural electrification, regulation, all that. I'm repeating myself, but you get the idea. In the 1930s, of course, you have these new players. You have the federal government through the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1933 first, and then the Rural Electrification Administration in 1935. And these organizations are upending the traditional relationship, a 10-year relationship or so, between utility companies and some farmers, not all farmers. And one should point out that even in the early 1930s, most utility people were still a bit leery of rural electrification. It just wasn't going to be as profitable as other segments could be. But there was this undercurrent movement. There were people within the utility industry. I highlight a guy named Grover Neff from Wisconsin, who seemed to be genuine in his concern for rural electrification. And he did a lot to convince some of his counterparts in the industry to pursue rural electrification. So again, but to be sure, the feds changed a lot in the 1930s.
Well, I wanted to, one of the last questions I want to ask you is just, some historians don't like counterfactuals, right? I mean, so counterfactuals are kind of imaginary scenarios where things had gone otherwise. And there's a lot of historians do not like doing that for good reasons, I think. Though I think there's also good reasons to run them now and then. And so, I mean, like, if you're doing a kind of counterfactual on this, it's clear that government action did a lot. Right? Including spurring on the firms via competition. But, do you think absent government regulation, we would have continue to see that kind of growth curve laid out?
Well,
you described earlier?
It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
Because even, absent federal intervention, there were still lots of farmers, especially farmers who didn't own their own land, tenant farmers, and especially in the South, who would not have been great customers. Because they didn't own their own land. The owners wouldn't want to invest in electrical equipment for the farm. It still would have been.
Well, there was lots of racial dimensions there. In the
absolutely.
South.
Especially in the South with a huge number of black farmers as tenant farmers. Okay. But I do use counterfactuals in my book because I point out that there were other approaches that could have been taken to yield more rural electrification. So I point out that in the 19-teens, 20s, and into the 30s, farmers who could not get wires strung to them, in some cases, they actually bought equipment to generate electricity themselves. There was a company called Delco Lighting Company, which was ultimately a subsidiary of General Motors. And Delco Light made this self-contained internal combustion unit that produced electricity with a generator. The electricity went into batteries, like car batteries. And you could light up your house and use equipment and all using the electricity that was self-generated. This device was amazing in many ways because when the batteries got discharged, before they got totally discharged, they would start the internal combustion engine up again and start producing electricity that would recharge the batteries.
Clever.
It was very clever. And there were other companies that did this too, but Delco Light became the big the biggest player here. And what that suggests, number one, is that farmers were not these, unknowledgeable, technically stupid people. There was a segment of these farmers who were really smart and who would use this equipment quite profitably. And the counterfactual comes into play here if you think about, well, what if there was no REA? What if half the farms didn't get electricity by wire? Well, a good chunk of them may have generated the electricity for themselves using what today we call distributed generation. Okay, and one of the reasons I like this counterfactual is because it has some policy implications. In Africa, for example, and other parts of the world, there are about 1 billion people in the world today who do not have access to electricity. Most of these people are rural. And there are organizations throughout the world that are trying to get these people electrified. The standard approach, like through the World Bank, is to finance distribution lines going from centralized power plants to these currently unserved. Well, let's go back to the 1920s and 30s in the United States and look at a model that was not adopted widely, namely self-generation, distributed generation. We have technologies 100 years later that are a lot more efficient. You can have you can have internal combustion engines generating electricity for a small community, but you can also have solar cells, you can have wind turbines, and indeed, there are people and there are organizations that are developing these distributed generation systems for smaller communities rather. This is not original with me at all, but it suggests that there was another way for farmers to get electricity, one that was used by about 4% of farmers by around 1930. And that is a model that could have persisted.
When I was reading that section of your book, there's a farm down in Giles County near us here. The farm's owned by the park system, and you can walk around there. I can't remember the name of it. I was going to say McDonald's, but I think that's an old song about a farm I once heard.
There's an old farm named McDonald's.
But down there, I'm pretty sure what I've seen is there's a mill on the property. And the mill was probably originally used as a grist mill, would be my guess.
Right.
But at some point, it was converted. The mill equipment was converted to drive electricity for the farm, and so I've actually checked it out. And
good for you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting.
Indeed, even Charles Seitz at Virginia Tech in the 1920s published a booklet for farmers through, I think it was the Department of Agriculture, how to use water flowing in rivers or streams on your farm to generate electricity. Okay, so it wasn't just these Delco Light generators. You had water turbines, generators. You had windmills producing electricity. Again, farmers who really wanted electricity and who had the money, of course, to buy this equipment could actually get it. And one could imagine that in the 1940s or so, with new materials, new metals, for example, that were developed during World War II, one could have produced these self-generating systems that were more reliable, more efficient, lower cost, so that, if you don't have wires come into your house, doesn't matter. You can produce the electricity yourself.
So thank you for writing this book, shaming all of us. I mean, I think that, as many historians of technology, myself included, in the classroom, many of us historians of technology, like myself included, are kind of big government libs. We love stories of the efficacy of government and regulation. I think for a long time, people have used the REA story as a story of effectiveness. And like you said, there's some truth.
Right.
But I do think, you've kind of poked a lot of holes in the standard narrative that's been around these things for a long time.
And I think, indeed, I am, as a sub-theme, I am taking a shot at some of the standard views of the relationships between federal government and private companies. Indeed. And I think that still has relevance today in efforts to bring broadband internet to rural areas. There are some people who are saying what we need is another REA effort. And what I might suggest is that no, that argument depends on accepting the standard view of the REA. And I think what we're seeing these days is a much more nuanced approach toward broadband that brings in private companies, although with large subsidies from federal government. But it's not just the REA's successor, the Rural Utilities Service, but a lot of private companies that are bringing broadband service to rural areas in a way that we saw electrification occur in rural America as well.
What's next for you? Do you have a next project, or what are you thinking, man?
Yeah, man. Man, I'm so old. I know that, we talk that way, man. I have some really groovy projects.
You do?
I have one groovy project I'm working on. So as you know, my primary hobby is that that I do work in emergency medicine. I'm an emergency medical technician for almost 35 years, and I love learning about and helping people who are in medical emergencies. I'm a CPR instructor and all that stuff. Well, I'm working on how the utility industry, starting in the 1880s and 90s, early in the industries, in trying to advance resuscitation techniques for people who were electrocuted and who stopped breathing. Okay,
wow.
And that picks up on actually a couple of hundred years of resuscitation history of resuscitation efforts, but it really got going in the 1890s, early 20th century. So I've been reading and writing drafts of stuff on how the utility industry was helping others develop these resuscitation techniques. And that, just as a quick fun thing, in the 1920s, New York Edison Company did work with several organizations, including Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and Public Health, where an engineer started working on how to stimulate the heart after it was stopped, in many cases due to an electrical shock. And that guy started work on external defibrillation.
Wow.
And even what we call CPR, external compressions. And that is stuff
that's great.
I teach in the
that's cool.
In the classroom.
I actually think we need a lot more history on emergency medical response in general. It's a kind of understudied area. And for instance, I've written about automobile accidents and stuff.
Right.
And when you look at the curves of those falling, I think a big portion of those, the continued falling of deaths per vehicles miles driven for a long time was driven by improved emergency medical response. And we just don't have that history yet. Yeah,
we don't. There's not. I've looked into this. There's not much work on the history of it. And it's just a fun way of combining my interests in emergency medicine and electricity. It's a shocking discovery of.
I know we were going to get at least one pun in
and
here.
And that's not even a good one. My goodness, that's a terrible pun.
Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's always a pleasure, Lee. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.